Good evening. Welcome to the April 9th meeting of the Oshtemo Township Planning Commission. Please rise and join us in the recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, we have an agenda that's been circulated and published. Has everybody had the opportunity to look at it? Are there any additions to be made to the agenda or deletions? All right, then could I have a motion for the approval of the agenda for tonight's meeting?
I move that we approve the agenda.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? And the ayes have it. Moving on to the approval of the March 26, 2026 meeting. Again, those have all been circulated. Has everybody had the chance to look at them? Are there any changes or corrections that need to be made? Well then, if I could have a motion and a second to approve the minutes as prepared.
I'll make a motion to approve the March 26th minutes as presented.
Support.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? And the minutes are approved. Next item is public comment on any non-agenda item. If you want to speak on something that is not on tonight's agenda, you have a 4-minute time limit. Please come up to the podium and state your position. Seeing no one, I'm going to move on to the next item, that being really the focus of tonight's meeting. And you're in for a real treat because we're all going to school tonight. Speakers tonight will primarily speak to the regulatory framework of Public Act 233. The guest speakers are public sector and academic experts who will provide a neutral and educational information. They are not from wind, solar, or battery storage industries, and they were not invited to advocate for or against specific projects. The speakers will give a brief presentation, followed by questions from the Planning Commission. An opportunity for public comment will follow as a separate agenda item. So everyone will speak, and then at the end, the public will have its opportunity to raise its questions. Questions heard during the public comment will be noted, and if time allows, the speakers will be asked to return to the podium and address them to the best of their ability. The Public and Planning Commission submitted questions over the past couple of weeks. Questions germane to tonight's presentation were forwarded to the speakers. Science and safety-focused questions are being held for a future time when subject matter expert input is obtained. Internally, a draft ordinance regulating energy systems is being prepared. Outside scientific input is being sought to strengthen the ordinance to best protect the township and its residents. A draft of the ordinance will be before the Planning Commission later this year and will likely take several meetings to walk through. Public comment is available at all Planning Commission meetings. Thank you. With that, Ms. DeForia, do you want to take it over?
Sure, thank you. We have some very generous speakers here tonight using their time to come educate us about Public Act 233 of 2023. We have Madeline Kroll from the University of Michigan, Graham Institute of Sustainability, Ian Flanagan? O'Leary, something Irish, from EGLE, and Sarah Mulkoff from Michigan Public Service Commission. And I believe Madeline and Ian are going to start together.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here. I'm hoping you're able to see our slides. Ian and I decided that we will tag team this and present together, so this will be a little bit longer than 20 minutes, but consequently, there will be a larger period of time for questions as well. My name is Madeline Kroll. I'm with the University of Michigan's Center for Empowering Communities, which is a center within the Graham Sustainability Institute. It's a mouthful. My job title there is Clean Energy Land Use Specialist. I'm a planner by training, and through funding from EGLE can provide technical assistance like tonight. We are going to really provide an overview. I think there's an agenda, yes. Really provide an overview over basics of renewable energy and energy storage development in Michigan, provide a bit of an intro to battery energy storage specifically, and then a very high-level overview of PA 233 and the resulting pathways and options that we see that local governments have at their disposal as they're navigating this law. We'll spend a little bit more time on one of the 4 pathways, which are workable zoning ordinances, and explain what they are and the strings attached to those, and then have some time for questions. I got ahead of myself a little bit. Here I am. This is the slide kind of presenting my work. I'm a planner by training. I do at the University of Michigan both research on impacts of renewable energy, energy storage, and just energy-related infrastructure on communities, the good and the bad, the trade-offs, and really provide kind of an overview. And I'm here tonight. My gas is paid for by EGLE, who has been funding our work at the University of Michigan since 2019 to help planning commissions and local governments in rural Michigan to think about planning and zoning for renewables as they're coming to Michigan. That looks like providing training like tonight, answering questions, providing feedback on ordinance drafts, which I'm able to do free of charge. I organize bus tours. I create guidebooks and resources to aid you folks in making decisions for your communities. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Ian, who's going to kick us off for the first segment of this. There you go.
Thank you. Hey, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. As Madeline and Jody said, I'm Ian O'Leary. I work over at EGLE's Energy Services Unit. So that's the team in EGLE that mainly gives grants relating to energy, usually like energy improvement. I've kind of come on as offering technical assistance to local governments about large-scale renewable energy. It's not really a person at EGLE who's trying to understand these laws and give actionable advice to local governments. So in that role, I've started to do workshops around the state. You can kind of see that through Michigan. We put some stars where we've went, as well as some webinars and just general answers and advice. So another role is that I manage the Renewables Ready Communities Award. That's going to be relevant today, so we'll talk about it later. I also wanted to point out that in EGLE, our department doesn't have a unique regulatory role for batteries or renewables. Kind of everything that gets built goes through standard EGLE environmental and wetland permitting. Any of the additional stipulations that are applied to batteries or wind or solar usually is seen at the federal level from local governments adopting federal fire codes or systems like that. So there's not a ton of agency that EGLE has in this space other than being able to just talk to you guys and kind of share what I know. As was pointed out, today's goal is not to recommend a particular permitting decision or an ordinance decision. We're just here to describe what we see as the possible decisions that a local government can make with this new kind of complicated law that we're going to pick through today and show you how each of those pathways would play out and how you can reach each of those pathways. Ultimately, the reason we're doing that is because we're kind of just zoning nerds. So we just like to learn these laws and kind of think through how it works, particularly from a proactive perspective, which it seems like you guys understand as well. So I'll start with the part one, where I kind of just cover the general role of renewable energy and what it's kind of doing in Michigan currently. So there's 2 main laws that are involved right now that I think are going to be pretty relevant for today's conversation. First is PA 233. This is the state citing legislation, which means that a developer of an energy project can seek a permit through the MPSC rather than through the local government in certain cases. that usually being an incompatible ordinance. We'll, of course, dive into that much more in a bit. The second important law is PA 235, which sets something called a renewable portfolio standard, aka a legal minimum of electricity that the utility has to provide via renewable energy sources. A very high renewable portfolio standard was passed in Michigan of 50% by 2030. That also involves a 2,500 megawatt energy storage goal by 2029. The map on the right just kind of gives you an idea of RPSs, as they're called, renewable portfolio standards, are showing up in a lot of states in differing degrees and different differing intensities. This one's a couple years old, so a couple more have spread out, but this is becoming a relatively standard system. Importantly, though, even before these two laws, which one of them makes energy projects pretty easy for a developer to start to approach and start to talk to local governments about, and then the second, which makes the state and utilities who buy electricity want a lot of renewables on the grid. Even before those two legislation pieces were passed, there was still a pretty big push by utilities to get renewable energy on the grid. Generally, the reason for that, and it's something important to keep in mind, is that there's no fuel cost for renewable energy. I'll tie this into why this matters for batteries in just a second, but generally when you think about renewables, once you build it, it's generating, and it's not subject to import costs for natural gas or for coal in the volatile markets that those usually bring with them. So generally, over the decades, as we see renewable tech get pretty cheap, as natural gas still is reliant on a fuel source, utilities see more long-term value in building a more consistent stream that isn't going to be subject to higher costs in the future, essentially. That's just setting up the space that all of this is now kind of coming into. So, storage and renewables are often said in the same breath. I've already done it today. However, as you know, batteries don't generate electricity. They simply manage how the electricity moves around the grid. Typically, however, energy storage is thought of right next to wind and solar, at least in the same sentences. The reason for that, there's kind of a metaphor of natural gas needs pipelines to get fuel where it needs to get generated. Renewables need storage to move electricity to when it is needed. Primarily, it's the classic idea of what about when the sun doesn't shine and when the wind doesn't blow? Batteries are meant to shave that off and make it a bit more of a reliable generation profile throughout the day, which is why it is very complementary to renewable energy and why they're often wrapped into the same goal together. There's a lot of different storage technologies, but like 98% of the time, and what we're talking about today is lithium-ion batteries. There's other stuff that Madeline will touch on, but lithium-ion batteries are a specific technology that has specific local impacts that we're going to be focusing on today. Other things I wanted to point out about storage is that it also offers some other grid services, which is why there's kind of a push to get a lot of it on the grid. Primarily, batteries allow some electricity to get you charge the battery when electricity is cheap, when there's a big surplus of it, and then you provide the electricity when there's a deficit. This is called energy arbitrage. Generally, it makes electricity cheaper because it wants to reduce the peak costs that are seen when there's a lot of demand and very little generation. The second grid service is that it contributes to balance frequency. Generally, when you turn on generators each morning as a grid operator, this natural gas plant, this coal plant, it's very inflexible. You have to look at a forecast ahead of time and plan it out. Batteries allow for a more kind of dispatchable way of turning generators on and off. So those are just some of the ways that storage contributes to the grid and why it's often paired with renewables. More of the kind of context we see, this is the existing projects that are in Michigan. So we've got about 4 gigawatts of wind, a little over 2 gigawatts of solar, and only about 100 megawatts of battery storage. So that's, quite a bit less. However, if we look in the MISO queue, which is the line that developers have to get into to build a project and plug it in, we see some larger trends. These numbers are not what actually gets built. The MISO queue usually gets cut like all the way down by the time things actually get built. But what you can see here is the relative amounts between technologies. The most in queue is solar. The second most in queue, battery storage. The third most in queue, and much lower, is wind. And then the fourth most is hybrid. That usually means wind and solar, solar and storage occupying the same site. So the takeaway here is that in this last slide, a very small percentage of existing projects are batteries, but a very high percentage of incoming projects or considered projects are batteries. So battery storage siting considerations are showing up all over the state, and it's a relatively new space. There's only 100 megawatts, 115 megawatts operating right now. So it's good to see a lot of due diligence and thought put into the process. All the things that I just talked about are grid connected. So we talk about utility scale, AKA grid connected renewables, and that's really important. It is different than rooftop solar or a backyard solar rig, or like a Tesla battery in a garage. If something is grid connected, then it is subject to all of these kind of unique principles of the grid. So the grid, of course, is the full eastern half of the United States. It is one gigantic kind of like balanced out pool of electricity. Utilities simply buy the electricity that gets pumped into there and distribute it locally on power lines. Why that matters is that it should be viewed as kind of a bucket of water. You can't pick, if you're drinking from a bucket of water with a straw, you can't say, I want the coal electron or I want the solar electron. It's all just electricity that's all averaged out in the same space. That means that the presence of solar in one township versus another, or the presence of batteries in one township or another, since we see the renewable energy portfolio standard meaning that a certain amount will be built, what that means is that any impacts on the grid level are assumed to be distributed across the whole grid. So things like reliability and cost, I just generally put those as not as in scope for today. What we want to talk about is what is different about one township hosting a battery versus another is the localized impacts, the things that actually happen in the immediate vicinity as a result of the technology. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. I got ahead of myself. Because of the renewable portfolio standard, a fixed amount will be built regardless of where. So the decision of a local permit or ordinance should focus on localized impacts. The grid level impacts are still important, but that's just kind of not really what the action that we're talking about today focuses on. Your turn.
I think this is where I come back in. Yes. Okay, so if some of you have been to Ludington on the west side of this beautiful state, you might have come across Ludington Pump Storage, which is, I think, the second or third largest hydro pump storage facility in the US and like the sixth largest in the world. It's a really cool piece of infrastructure for energy nerds. Either way, this facility is Michigan's first energy storage project, and it was built in the 70s. So the concept of storing energy when there is excess of it for a later time is not new. It just looked very different back in the day. So I'm showing you this picture because I think it helps, again, understand to underline Ian's point from earlier, power being instantaneous. If you don't use it in the moment, it goes to waste. So the way this facility was set up in the 70s, when there was excess nuclear energy on the grid during the nighttime when everyone's asleep, to not have that energy go to waste, they used that energy to pump up water from Lake Michigan into a higher reservoir. And then during the day, when there's demand for energy, release that, and it basically functions as a hydro dam. It's a really cool piece of infrastructure, but I'm going off topic. Anywho, this is a way of storing energy, but as you can see, it takes up a gigantic footprint, and there's a very limited amount of sites across Michigan or across the country of where these kinds of projects can go. Q batteries for the EV market, for like home usage. We as a society have become increasingly dependent on batteries. Ian has already mentioned 98% of utility-scale energy storage projects in Michigan are lithium-ion based because that is a dominant technology in EV batteries as well. And so the way I find it helpful to explain what a battery storage system is to really start small. So inside these shipping container-looking containers, or enclosures as they're often called, they're far away from shipping containers because they're highly specialized and super technical, but in the insides, you have a bunch of battery cells just packed together on shelves and modules and on racks, and then have just a bunch of shipping containers like this. And so key components of these battery systems are the cells and then the actual physical enclosure. But they are very high-tech. So they come with cooling equipment to keep the batteries at a comfortable temperature. We all know in the freezing cold, our phone battery dies quicker than during spring temperatures. And so similarly, the batteries need cooling and steady temperature control. So it depends a little bit. Sometimes it's like liquid cooling or air cooling and like how these batteries are actually technically cooled. But oftentimes you might see a fan or similar equipment on these enclosures. All of these battery enclosures also come with a complicated set of, and I'm not an engineer, I should say, with a complicated set of systems that manage the temperature, that manage gases or pressure in the enclosure, explosion prevention systems, control systems, fire alarms. All the bells and whistles are usually coming with these enclosures. You see here, these are some pictures from out of state because, like Ian has mentioned, we don't have a ton of battery storage in Michigan at the moment to give you more localized examples. But you see there's usually, like, wiring is happening underground. There are additional components to these systems beside the big enclosures, which are inverters. And then usually a substation would be nearby. So this is kind of how they look like on a zoomed in level. And I maybe just should acknowledge also, this is my time to say, there are loads of different kind of battery chemistries that are being developed, that are being studied, that are being deployed at smaller scale, but lithium-ion has a gigantic dominance on the market at the moment. So there's some buzz around sodium-ion batteries and how might they differ from a lithium-ion battery from a safety standpoint or those kinds of things. But there's a lot to be still figured out of how can we scale those other kinds of technologies up. So for the moment, lithium-ion it is. Battery storage is, because of this enclosure model, really scalable depending on how much space is available in a location. So you see, you are, for the past 8 years, since 2018, you have been living in the general proximity of Michigan's very first battery energy storage system, which is on Western Michigan University's campus, the Parkview Battery Project by Consumers Energy, which is a 1 megawatt. And if you're not living in the energy space daily like I do, then maybe the 1 megawatt doesn't mean much to you. But just for reference, the first big battery that is now operational in Coldwater Township and Branch County is 100 megawatts. So it's 100 times the battery power of that Western Michigan University battery. So I'm having some pictures here so that you can get a sense for how do these things look like. DTE is having, besides consumers, DTE is also involved in battery development. So there's the Slocum BESS in Wayne County. I believe it is operational. It's a 14 megawatt project. And then currently under construction is a 220 megawatt project by DTE, also in Wayne County, which is like the rendering in the bottom right corner that you see. So the only big one we have operational in Michigan right now is that Tibbetts BESS in Coldwater Township. Where do developers look for BESS development? Where are these things cited? So number one key requirement is developers look for where there's access to the grid. And here on the right side, you see a picture. If you click the link, you can access this tool freely, where it shows all of the transmission lines in the state as well as substations. And so you can really zoom into any one place and see where in my township is the infrastructure that any energy project needs to hook into, or energy user would also hook into. So grid access is the number one criteria. And not just that there is a grid, but also that the grid in that particular place has capacity to hold or to be added to. A third component is proximity to where the people need energy. And so sometimes I get folks from the UP asking me why we don't see more BESS development in the UP. Currently, it is where those tight grid spots are in like the lower half of lower Michigan, proximity to the load centers, and also available land. But as you can see from the pictures that I showed earlier, the footprint of these battery energy systems is, compared to like a solar farm or a wind park, relatively small. And so they really do fit everywhere. There is an opportunity to site these systems on brownfields, though again, you need grid access, you don't maybe need remediation. So there are some limitations in how far you can place batteries onto brownfields. I have this table, which looks more confusing than it needs to, but I'm showing here kind of the footprint of these systems. So in the bottom left corner, you see the largest operational project, which is that Coldwater Township project, is 100 megawatts and sits on approximately 5 to 7 acres. So it's really not big. Again, my bias is solar and wind. I should acknowledge that. The size of proposed projects in the MISO queue that Ian has showed earlier on the map is larger than 100 megawatts. It's around 175 megawatts. And then there are some projects in the queue that are up to 500 megawatts, which even in the biggest project scenario would probably not exceed much than 50 acres. So again, relatively small. Okay, I would like to spend quite a significant amount of time on this slide because every energy infrastructure has pros and cons. Everything has trade-offs. And as Ian has mentioned, we really care about the local concerns and benefits rather than the zoomed out, how does it affect the grid at large? Those are still relevant, but I think for you all, like talking about local impacts is key. So I've split it up into local benefits and local concerns, and I'm going to start with the benefit side. Again, it's a very small footprint with a relatively big tax payment. So the industrial personal property tax and the real property tax that a developer pays, because of the value of that equipment on site, is relatively high. The State Tax Commission is offering guidance on which tax table to use and how the depreciation tables look like over time. And I'm going to have a shameless plug here. We are, actually, no, I'm going to hold that for the next slide. But so it's a small footprint with a big tax payment associated with it. The other bullet in that first bullet is the landowner payments. So again, my daily bread and butter is wind and solar, where there's loads of landowners involved that are either receiving lease payments, or sometimes in the case for solar, the property is sold to the developer. So there's money coming into the community. I'm not sure whether they're spending it, if they're retiring to Florida and spending it there, or if they're spending it in the county or in the community. But for batteries, because the property is so small, it is typically just one landowner that is involved. I've mentioned already an opportunity for brownfields, so I'm going to kind of skip that one. And then I often get the questions about jobs. The renewable energy sector will generate all of these jobs. For local job creation, a battery energy storage project, like any kind of land use change, is a construction activity for the beginning of time. So there are some rather highly specialized electrical jobs associated with construction period, but then in the long term, during operations, there isn't really loads of jobs that are created in the community. So there's typically, or in the case of Coldwater Township, there is a staff member there that is kind of living nearby, supervising the project 24/7, and is like the contact person for the township, but it's not this whole team of people that is constantly working on site. The last bullet is on grid resilience, and I'm inclined to say it's actually less of a local benefit, or there's a big caveat with it, which is really, are we looking at the grid at large? Yes, batteries provide grid benefits, many that Ian has laid out, but your grid resilience here in Oshtemo Township is not going to be exclusively better than the township next door because of how you're hosting the battery. It is possible to set batteries up to connect them to the distribution grid rather than the high voltage power lines, and then there would be a localized, exclusive grid resilience benefit to your township. But in case of like these utility scale projects that we're talking about that are subject to PA 233, those are too big to go onto the distribution grid. Okay, local concerns. It is a visual change. White shipping containers, depending on where you plop them down, have a visual change with them, like any kind of development does. There is a sound concern, a legitimate sound concern with these systems. So depending on the cooling equipment, like the HVAC systems, the fans make noise, the inverters make noise. So those are sound emissions that are coming from the project that also depend a little bit on the kinds of equipment that is being used in that specific project, on how loud this is, or how loud it is perceived. It also matters what's going around. Is there a highway nearby, or is it a quiet, tranquil area? So these systems do emit noise, and it is something that is very typically addressed through a sound ordinance in communities or a sound standard. There is environmental impacts in the sense that if there is a fire safety incident, then concerns are raised about air quality and plume and what gases are in the air, but it is really difficult to quantify that ahead of time because it depends on how charged is the battery, how many batteries are on fire, what's the weather like, to really kind of inform like the air quality component of it. And there's often concerns around groundwater. It's the standard at this point now, industry standard and fire response standard, is that you don't put water onto the burning battery because it doesn't actually put it out. And so that way you kind of prevent having water mixed with battery chemistry and leak everywhere. So there is a legit fire and explosion risk with, this is the number one local concern with battery energy systems, though I also do want to say they are getting increasingly safe without injury. And then the last one is decommissioning, which is, I think, something, if I could turn back time 30 years, I would throw out and suggest, should we, for all large land uses, require decommissioning? And it is industry standard in the renewable energy space for wind and solar projects that decommissioning bonds and decommissioning agreements are being prepared. And it is also industry standard for battery energy storage projects to make sure if the project has reached its end of life, or if the owner suddenly disappeared, this is worst case scenario, obviously, but then the township is in a place where it has the financial means to ensure infrastructure is removed and that property is returned back to a usable site. I want to dwell a little bit longer on the two key concerns. So the key benefit and the key concern. The key benefit really is this economic development piece. Again, this tax payment, it's a little bit problematic if, or what our team has tried to really understand in the past half year is how property taxation works for wind, solar, and battery energy storage in Michigan. And we have pulled together policy explainers and calculator tools to really explain for wind and solar how this works. We do not have that nitty-gritty detail available for battery energy storage at this moment, but we're working on it. To really calculate what would the tax revenue have been if the property just stays as is, compared to how does revenue change for the county, for the school district, for the township? How does it change in year 1, in year 10, in year 15, if there is a BESS? So again, we do have these for solar and wind, but not for BESS at the moment. We also have worked on a guidebook called Strategies for Renewable Energy Revenue, which includes storage, where we're talking about how communities across Michigan have used millage rates to kind of get the biggest bang for their buck and to really think strategically about what might some strategies be that apply in a particular place as they're thinking about using that revenue coming in to their place? If you're interested in a copy of that guidebook, I have some with me. The local concern, again, I'm switching back and forth, I apologize. On the concern side, I have mentioned thermal runaway is the key fire safety concerns with these batteries, is if they're starting to overheat and then they just keep overheating and that process can't really be stopped. This is a figure that I am showing you where it shows this like light blue graph going up is deployed gigawatt hours of storage in the, I believe this is a global database. It's a BREEZE Battery Energy Storage Failure Incident Database, which you could access if you'd like to, where it shows the BESS being deployed over time between 2018 and 2024. And then the blue bars, the dark blue bars, are the number of failure incidents where there has been a failure. And the orange line is basically referring to failure incidents per deployed gigawatt. And you can see over time, the more batteries we built, the more industry has learned how to prevent these fires, that they have gotten safer over time. Why have they become safer over time? The National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, has over time developed a standard for the installation of stationary energy storage systems, which I just call NFPA 55, and it is now industry standard and is also part of the MPSC and P233 process for battery energy storage to require compliance with this fire standard, because it stipulates the certification certain systems need to have to make sure they're safe batteries that have been fire tested, basically intentionally set on fire to see what happens if they do burn, how is their fire behavior, management systems, fire response systems, and also includes like collaborative planning between the developer and the local fire responders to make sure if there is an incident, and it is unlikely but is not 100% impossible. If there is an incident, everyone knows what to do and what not to do and what to touch and what not to touch. And so this is the gold standard of fire safety, and is a component of loads of ordinances in Michigan that I am seeing on battery storage. One note I do want to make is that some of the technical specs that we might want to know from a developer at this point are often only known way later. And so some of these are after land use permit. As the developer is preparing for construction, the exact battery chemistry or model that they're ordering might only be known then. And so I have seen local communities in Michigan condition special land use permit on the submission of those later documents to make sure to verify compliance with the code. It's very technical though. Okay, collaborative planning is essential, so, and I've already mentioned this, so a key component of everything battery energy storage is really collaborating with the fire chief, maybe neighboring fire departments, everyone who would like to participate in education on what do we do if there is an incident. And you see here a picture of a fire marshal kind of checking out an empty enclosure. And really making sure, this is my last bullet, about building capacity for local first responders. All across rural Michigan, volunteer fire departments, making sure that there is the people and that there's the equipment and that there are the resources and education to know and to be able to respond to an incident. So it's now common standard that developers pay annually for training or offer training for the duration of the project to make sure if there's turnover in the fire department, everyone knows what to do. Okay, this is my time for shameless plugs. I have authored, together with my colleague Sarah Mills, a guidebook where I'm explaining all of the benefits and the concerns, and also have a sample zoning ordinance. I brought some copies and I believe I have more. We have more guidebooks on solar, but I'm going to keep it short here in the effort of time. And hand it back to Ian. That's right, yeah.
Do you know how much time we have left? I don't want to go too over. Oh, okay. All right. Well, Yeah, so now we know the general role of batteries in the grid, and we kind of know what they look like locally. So now we're going to dive into the zoning stuff of how to actually respond to all of that from the local government perspective. The main thing we need to talk about is Public Act 233. I referenced it before, I'll just be calling it PA 233. So this creates an option for a developer to ask the Michigan Public Service Commission, the MPSC, to permit for a grid-connected renewable energy project, which again includes BESS in that, if an affected local unit does not have a compatible renewable energy ordinance, which we call CREO. A CREO is a specific list of zoning items that were provided in the law itself. There are copies on the table back there too, but I'll give you a little bit of a tour. This became active on November 29th, 2024, so it's still pretty new. There's only, honestly, a handful of projects that have started going down this route, so we're still learning a lot about it, and you'll learn some more later today as well. It only applies to large-scale projects, so 50 megawatts is a minimum, or 100 for wind. And there's two really important points that I want to make sure are underlined. One, a developer is not required to go to the MPSC even if the local government doesn't have a CREO, even if they have their own local ordinance. A developer can stay local even in that case, and there's a lot of good reasons why they will probably do so in a lot of cases, which I will show you. And then the other point is that we're talking about permitting here, which means that the energy project already has secured a lease with a voluntary landowner host. The permit comes after that security has been made, of course. So just making sure that this isn't that this is distinguished from eminent domain. So there is someone in the system who has secured a lease at that point. So in this system where there is now an option for a developer to seek a permit elsewhere, I see 4 general permitting pathways that any project can go down. The first is through a CREO. So again, this is the Compatible Renewable Energy Ordinance. It is pre-written and it is relatively permissive for renewable energy projects from a zoning standards perspective. Generally, this leads to easy development for the developer. Then there are 2 pathways that are incompatible. So at this point, you're not a CREO, but you're still doing a local zoning ordinance. So there's kind of 2 ways that a local zoning ordinance can play out if it's not a CREO. One is if it is a workable ordinance. This is one that is just a standard local zoning ordinance that is still stricter than a CREO. So it ups the requirements from those baseline levels, but it does inherently make room for BESS or renewables. The other difficulty of workables is that no 2 are the same. It is completely project dependent and developer dependent, because at any point, if you have this type of ordinance, a developer can call the MPSC. If it's basically, we interpret the CREO very conservatively. So if it's even an inch stricter than the CREO, safe bet is that it can get taken to the MPSC. The other half of that coin, obviously, is if you have a local ordinance that a developer does call the MPSC for, we term that an unworkable ordinance. This is just one that the developer has deemed not suitable for that project that they're developing and will probably go to the MPSC. That one's pretty straightforward. And then the final path is state level certification. So a project can get sent to the MPSC for a permit, either by the local government or by the developer. So yeah, a township can at any point say that they're dishing it that way. There's some complexity in how that happens, but that's generally the case. At that point, the energy project will then apply for a certificate going through the MPSC's own standards and conditions, and we'll dive into those in quite a bit of detail here. The general point I want to make is that not all projects go to the state. So the idea that a local government permit can get circumvented seems like it would be very attractive for developers, but how it actually plays out is that state citing option gives developers a backstop for difficult cases. They need some certainty for their, for their project finances, essentially. But what we've learned is that going down the state route is not the first choice for a developer. This is because the MPSC application process has pretty extensive conditions, and it can take up to a year, which is a lot. Time is money, and that is a lot of time in that case. So developers generally, even with this option, trying to go local first. They don't want to necessarily go down the expensive, costly route of state citing if it can be avoided, which buys local governments the opportunity to have a workable ordinance between the CREO as the baseline of the most permissive version and then the MPSC standards as kind of the ceiling there. Importantly, this is not true for all developers in projects. Some developers still may just go right to the state. They may have a project designed that they already have it, they're already getting that stuff ready. So I want to make sure that it's not, assumed to be the case always. MPSC certification is still viable in a lot of cases, but the general average is local first. Okay, so a couple points that I need to make before we zoom into the zoning stuff. One is that any utility scale renewable energy project pays property taxes to the local government. We already talked about this. Generally, that's routine. It's guaranteed. It's already been in the conversation for decades. So in recent years, just the last couple, Michigan has added an additional revenue stream to local governments for whether it goes down the local permitting route or the state route. So there's an additional revenue stream on top of the property tax. If it's a locally permitted project, AKA it went through a CREO or a workable ordinance, anything that's not state, then it is eligible for the RRCA, which is the Renewables Ready Communities Award. That is an EGLE grant. It gives $2,500 to $5,000 per megawatt to the local government that can then be spent on any project of public benefit. So like road repairs or recreation or town hall upgrades is what we usually see. On the other half, if it goes down the state route, the additional revenue is $2,000 per megawatt that the developer pays, and it goes through a specific type of community benefits agreement called a host community agreement. So if you hear us use that term, host community agreement or HCA, it's referring to that additional state citing kind of developer paid payment. Each of those has a small caveat that I want to cover just as you're considering this. So this additional revenue, if it's the local version or the RRCA, this requires the developer to cooperate with EGLE on certain requirements, specifically the nature of how they're building the project has to be held to union standards. And in the majority of cases, this will pose no issue. But generally, I want to make sure that if you're considering this fund, you make sure you have a clear conversation with your developer and say, hey, EGLE needs this thing to be done, or have you had that talk? Like, are you moving in that direction? If this ever becomes of interest to you, come talk to me, because this is something that we're figuring out and I want to make sure is still really clearly communicated to anyone who wants to learn about it. For the additional revenue on the state side, the caveat is that the community host agreement only goes to the zoning jurisdiction. So if a county zones and a township hosts, then the money just goes to the permitter. So it would just go to the county and not the township. The RRCA doesn't operate that way. If the county zones and the local and the township hosts, it gets split and applied to both. Just another quick splash about this so you can understand this grant, RRCA. As we said, with PA 233, local governments now receive an additional $2,000 per megawatt that the developer pays. So when that came out of PA 233, EGLE matched it and created the RRCA, which grants up to $5,000 per megawatt if it's local. Importantly, that's paid by EGLE, not the developer. So to get that requires a workable ordinance to have been accepted. So it requires developer cooperation and participation for the grant, but we've established that developers generally want to avoid state citing due to the cost and length and hold it as a backstop. So what we saw initially is that local governments were kind of incentivized to just dish it to the state because you'd get more money, you'd get $2,000 per megawatt and if it just went that way. So this grant is meant to make the local permitting route more mutually beneficial for each party because it's a greater dollar amount down the local route and it helps the local government actually get more of their preferences than you see in a CREO and try to make out better from it. As I said, I'm the grant manager for this, so if you ever want to know about it, you can email me. Okay, so as I mentioned before, a workable ordinance is kind of a sweet spot that a developer sees as reasonable, that exists somewhere above the very permissive floor of a CREO and the restrictive ceiling of the MPSC standards, which are pretty thorough. So let's zoom in on what that floor looks like, the baseline that a workable ordinance is built on. This shows you the items that are included in the pre-written zoning ordinance. Not the numbers. I haven't written the actual like feet of the setback or the decibels of the sound, but you can see those in the act very easily. Generally, they're pretty permissive. As I said, we interpret this conservatively. So if you have anything more than this, our advice is to not consider it a CREO and to consider it a workable ordinance. Because if you claim you have a CREO and then it is determined that you don't have a CREO, the local government can incur penalties from that. So if you're not making a CREO, consider yourself to be in the workable ordinance territory and know that that's an okay place to be in because developers still want to have that talk. As I said, you can reference the act. I've got a link here and there's some printed in the back if you want to see how this ordinance actually looks. The ceiling is the standard that the MPSC holds projects to, which is pretty thorough. So they have the same zoning standards, but there's a lot of additional conditions put on top of that. Just to run through some of the best ones, there's a sound study and compliance study that is done. Annual best emergency response training is necessary. And then with some of the other technologies, you see pretty thorough things like shadow flicker studies, additional concerns for screening and ground cover, which aren't involved in the CREO. So there's a strong baseline that the MPSC sets. Additionally, if a project goes through the state level, and again, I'm kind of defining the ceiling of the workable ordinance here, then the developer has to pay $75,000 to local governments for case intervention funds to be able to intervene in the case. They also have to pay that host community agreement, and there's a very long window of 365 days for the MPSC to consider an application if it has even been deemed complete, which if an application is incomplete, which has a lot of documentation involved in it, then they're back to the beginning, still waiting for that process. Additional conditions that the MPSC requires developers to demonstrate is that the project does not unreasonably diminish farmland, does not present an unreasonable threat to public health or safety, that the percentage of land dedicated to energy generation was considered, and why alternative sites were not feasible, and then some. These are generally statements that the developer has to compile and the MPSC assesses them. I won't speak too much on them because you've got the expert in the room. Okay, for each of those 4 pathways, I'm going to cover why not, and how for each of them. Why would you do a CREO? If you are interested in hosting renewables and want to be generally approached by developers. It also guarantees that the processing of the project stays local, but it is performatively because you can't necessarily iterate on the ordinance or the permit past that point. It also has minimal municipal workload. You copy and paste an ordinance. It is also eligible for the RRCA because it is technically a local route because it's not going through the state. Why would you want to send it to the state? If you have studied the MPSC's conditions and processes and looked at some of the cases that are currently going through the docket and decided that that's a pretty fair bar that's been set. It also comes with a low municipal workload because you kind of just get to pass accountability to the state. You throw your hands up and say, okay, well, have fun. It also involves a host community agreement, as I mentioned, of $2,000 per megawatt. Why would you want to make a workable ordinance? Because this is zoning ordinances as you know them. So it goes through the usual local process. But as I said, while stricter than a CREO, it does have to make room for renewables in order for a developer to not call the MPSC. This means that you need to have a bit of a back and forth dialogue with the developer. There needs to be some iteration if there are particular items that they identify as deal breakers. And ultimately, a workable ordinance is eligible for the RRCA still. For an unworkable ordinance, you would want to make that for the same reason that you want to make the workable ordinance, but the content of that ordinance would be different. It would express strong and plentiful community preferences, and generally you should interpret that route as routing through the MPSC route, because that's probably what a developer will do at that point. Why not? You wouldn't pick a CREO because you cannot add more preferences to it, and if you deny a project that is adhering to that compatible ordinance, then you've moved on past the CREO, essentially. As I mentioned, there are penalties for a false CREO, and it depends on neighbors. If you pass a CREO and your neighboring township, who is going to share the same solar project with you, doesn't have a CREO, then it's going to the state. Or let's say that they have an unworkable ordinance, then the whole project goes to the state despite you having a CREO. So it requires collaboration. Why wouldn't you want to go down the state? Because you cannot add more preferences similar to the other routes. And the MPSC conditions are strong, but they may not reflect your particular community priorities if you've identified specific items that aren't shown there. And it has a lower additional revenue than the local route, the $2,000 versus the $5,000. You wouldn't want to make a workable ordinance because it requires a very quick and well-informed ordinance that is usually in response to a project. So the developer already has a location in mind, and they already have certain project characteristics in mind, which leave you, a bit less room to respond. It is also context dependent. As I said, every project and developer is different, and all the while you retain the risk of being called incompatible if you're in that space. And an unworkable, why not? The reason that you would want to not pass a very strongly restrictive ordinance that is clearly in that space is because, firstly, it'll probably go to the state. But secondly, that identifies that township as being relatively easy to approach with a state-cited project in mind. So a local government still wants to have an ordinance that is within the workable threshold so that a developer knows that the type of local government they're working with is one that has put in due diligence and has an expectation for the project to continue going through the local route. How? For a CREO, it's pretty easy. As I said, you copy and paste the CREO. For the MPSC route, you would not worry about your ordinance necessarily for this specific project. Obviously, you should have an ordinance in place regardless, but if there's a particular project that you see going down this route, you can request the MPSC to require the developer to get the certificate through them by contacting the MPSC directly. How you would make a workable is quite complex and is the remainder of our discussion. You say, I do not have a CREO, but I do want it to be local. And you would probably find an attorney and other technical assistants and advisors who know this stuff, and you're going to try to form an ordinance that occupies that sweet spot that a developer will work within. And you do have to show a willingness to converse and iterate more than likely with the developer. You pass an unworkable ordinance by saying you do not have a CREO, and you formally request a local permit, just like the other route. But generally, this kind of inherently means that you have no intention of amending it further or responding to the project, so it would more than likely get routed down the MPSC route. I'll pass it to Madeline to talk about workability in detail.
Thank you, Ian, and I acknowledge we're running a little over time because I talk too much. But if that's all right, I would take us to the finish line. Okay, Ian has laid it out really well that a workable ordinance, or like a zoning ordinance that's not a CREO, but it's a local ordinance, and it is something that a developer, at the end of the day, it's up to the developer to deem it workable or not. The law gives them that power. So it is somewhere between CREO as the floor and MPSC is the ceiling. Somewhere in there, if it's getting too restrictive, the developer, you hit the tipping point and the developer might take it to the Michigan Public Service Commission. I have been going through zoning ordinances over zoning ordinances over zoning ordinances because I'm a researcher and this is what I do. And I've pulled together all ordinances in the state that from townships where there is an active wind or solar project going or operational, and have looked at, okay, how can we get a sense for what developers find workable? Let's look at what has been workable in the past, before PE 233 or even just in recent years, to get a sense for what kind of setbacks did communities ask for that then developers build a project on, or what kind of noise standards. And so we've pulled together this wildly overwhelming Excel sheet that you can access at this link to really see all of the battery or solar and wind projects and what the respective zoning ordinance language is, to just get a sense for what might have been workable in the past. Because we only have one big operational battery energy storage project in Michigan, in Coldwater Township, which was not subject to a special land use permits. There is currently 0 operational projects or ordinances I can point to, but I currently have a brilliant student kind of search through the internet and find places in Michigan where battery storage projects have recently been approved by townships to see what did their ordinances look like so that we can get a sense for what setbacks, if not those spelled out in PA 233, what setbacks have developers agreed to in the past. So our pool of projects to rely on for batteries is really small. I'm working on it. In the meantime, know that we're having this data and updating it as we come across more ordinances. But from what I have seen from from solar and wind, is that no zoning ordinance in Michigan really is a CREO. Every zoning ordinance that I've come across has some additional standard, either by limiting the location, AKA a zoning district, of where a solar project could go, because that's what zoning does, right? Or have a more restrictive setback. And so I personally color-coded which zoning standards match what PA 233 requires and what is more restrictive. And that is how I kind of came up with this data. And so I want to acknowledge two observations. I want to say that just because this setback was doable in this township doesn't mean that this setback is also going to be doable in this other project here in our community, because the property size might be different, because the developer might have different technology that they're deploying, or are subject to different sound specs of a specific inverter, who knows what. So some of what has worked before isn't automatically going to be workable for you, but it is a starting point. And I also want to say that taking the top end of the maximum, the most restrictive setback you can find in this data set, and the most restrictive sound standard you can find in this ordinance database, taking all of the most restrictive versions of everything is probably also not workable. So I think it is a helpful resource, but take it with a grain of salt. I want to summarize, as you are thinking, if you are decided to go down the workable pathway, and I'm not suggesting that that is what you should do, because like Ian said, every pathway has its pros and cons, but if you are pursuing workable or are reviewing an existing draft and its workability, then here are 4 strategies I quickly want to run through. So number 1 is fine-tuning a CREO item. So basically taking what's in PA 233 for a CREO, 50, for example, sound standard, and then changing the numbers. So I'm going to show you, you don't need to read all of this. I'm going to keep it short. Here are the sound standards for solar, for CREO, MPSC, workable and unworkable. So again, this yellow column was what I found in the data. And you can really tweak, so what is in the CREO is a non-participating structure, sound standard of 55 decibel or dBA, LEQ 1 hour, so measured on average over the course of an hour. And so you have different tweak points that I've seen in ordinances where you can kind of take the CREO standard but tweak it a little bit to make it more in line with what you want. Perhaps you don't want to measure at the structure but at the property line, because that's what most zoning ordinances do. Or you want to change that number from 55 to something else. But what's actually really impactful is whether you have the LEQ 1 hour, which is I stand with my noise meter machine next to a solar project and measure on average over an hour, this inverter doesn't exceed 55 dBA, or is it an LMAX? And a lot of zoning ordinances contain incomplete sound, like the LEQ is missing. Anyways, I'm getting too much into the weeds. Another example other than sound is setbacks. So where do you measure setbacks from? And what is the actual feet number are ways of taking the CREO standard and tweaking it a little bit. And if you only tweak it a little bit, it shouldn't shoot you into unworkable territory entirely. But that is kind of how you can dance around workability. A second strategy is mirroring what the MPSC does. And I'm excited that we'll hear more about the MPSC later. Because if the MPSC is requiring something, why shouldn't you do that without tipping the scale to be more restrictive? So an example for this is screening. In a CREO, and again, Ian and I are not attorneys, but in our most conservative interpretation of what a CREO can be, we do not think screening can be a requirement in a CREO for a solar project. But the MPSC staff does, or the MPSC, does have it as a potential condition of approval it can require from the developer to implement screening kind of case by case. And so similarly, I have seen in all sorts of solar ordinances across the state a requirement for visual screening through planting of vegetation. And so if it's reasonably done, and rather than requesting like a mini forest around the entirety of the project, that's probably unworkable, but somewhere in between should be wiggle room for some discretion. A third strategy is paying extra attention to deal breaker items because certain zoning items bring a high risk of outright unworkability. One of these examples is limiting where a project can go, especially if a community is reacting to a proposal by a developer that already has locations in mind. It is really difficult to nudge them to go somewhere else because things like grid access, gaining access to that property are already kind of studied, and so that property makes sense to the developer. And so in a CREO, for example, all districts are open for game. Again, we're not attorneys. I'm repeating myself, but that's important. But in workable zoning ordinances, it is very reasonable to steer where development can go while still making sure there's enough area in a township or in a place where a battery proposal or a solar proposal reasonably makes sense, so that there is some room to actually build a project. The fourth strategy is to get yourself some easy wiggle room. There are things that the MPSC is requiring that most local governments do not require. And if you spare the developer the paperwork, then maybe you can ask for something instead that you prioritize more. Or, yeah. So, timeline, or I think a good example of this is actually the alternative locations analysis. So the MPSC is requiring developers to explain why different locations were suitable or not, and why they ultimately decided on a particular site. If you make a developer, or if you request that kind of information from a developer, when the developer already has in mind where they want to go, then just making them do the paperwork, if you can't really act on it anyways, might be something you might be willing to omit in return perhaps for a slightly more protective setback or for something else that you prioritize more. Another example is the MPSC is requiring very diligent proof of the developer consulting with other regulatory agencies, like Ian's regulatory colleagues in EGLE or others, to consult with these kind of agencies for other permits. They have to get the permit anyways at the end of the day, so would you rather see proof of the developer doing their homework, or is there something in return that you find more important that you do want to make sure you get into your workable zoning ordinance? So it's a bit of a trade-off and a balancing of priorities. What is really tricky, and I'm about to wrap up, is that while I believe there are 8 renewable energy projects filed with the Michigan Public Service Commission already, which are currently being reviewed. No project has been decided on yet. But as the commission is responding to or requesting additional documentation from the developer, we are observing the process and are learning more from what the MPSC is actually looking for. The issue is there isn't a single BESS project on the desk of the MPSC yet. So I think there is some of it that is still, we will see how things play out. What you can do, I think, in the meantime, is really discovering and highlighting priority concerns for your township. If you can't put it all in the zoning ordinance because a developer finds this too restrictive, what is it really that you are protective of? And where are you able to put some priorities lower on the list and that you could live without? Or at what point do you say, okay, this zoning item is so important to us, if a developer can't comply with this, then we'd rather have it go to the state. So where are the priorities? What are the trade-offs that you are comfortable with and that are still in the spirit of the community? And at which point might the MPSC pathway be your preferred pathway? We have actually developed a game for this because games about zoning are fun and nerdy. It is currently for solar. We have played it with Kalamazoo County before. We've offered a workshop a month ago. And I'm happy to leave these with you or talk more about these, but it really practices this idea of prioritizing. If I can't have it all, then what is most important on our to-do list or on our priority list. And as Ian has already mentioned, talking to others, talking to your planner, talking to your getting your attorney on board, if not already, is my recommendation. I'm not really making recommendations, but that is one that I do feel comfortable with, is like getting prepared, talking to other communities in Michigan that have experience with BESS. I'm sending everyone to Coldwater Township in the meantime, and asking the folks at the MPSC, which are coming up next. So you're already in the process of doing all of these things. We've got lots of resources, and then I'm going to zip it and hand it over to you for some questions. We have resources on the law, FAQs, video presentations if you want to dig even deeper and like listening rather than reading. We have videos for this as well. And the Michigan Townships Association has resources on PA 233, and ultimately the MPSC is a fabulous resource as well. With that, we have reached the end of our presentation, and if there's any time, we're welcome to take some questions. I would be happy.
Yeah, we did submit questions, but if you have any other, it's up to you, Mr. Chair, if you want to take them now or save them for the end.
Let's take now, let's take our ones that we have submitted.
No, I've already sent them to them. I don't know if anyone sitting up here has a question they want to voice tonight that hasn't been addressed.
Were the questions that were submitted all addressed by the presentation that we just went through?
I was not going down the line.
Some of them,
Commissioner Verplank sent a few, so maybe he can speak to it.
Were your questions answered?
Can you guys turn your mics on, please?
I would just as soon wait and hear from the MPSC personally, but whatever they want to do.
All right. With that, then,
Your mic on.
well, we'll go on to the MPSC presentation then? All right.
Yep, it's like they're getting ready.
hi.
Thank you very much for putting that together, both of you.
Oh, cool. Okay.
I'd like to say you made it all crystal clear, but my head is swarming with turbulence.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Looks good. Good evening, everyone. My name's Sarah Molkoff. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm with the Michigan Public Service Commission, and so my colleagues Ian and Madeline covered a lot of really extensive material, and I'm so happy to be, following their information. So I have a presentation too. I'll move through it pretty swiftly, knowing that there's some repeated information and want to be attentive to your questions. So again, thanks for having me. I'm Sarah Molkoff. I'm the manager of the Renewable Energy section at the MPSC. So my goal tonight is to break down further a bit more information about who the MPSC is and what our process is, and kind of some early observations and learnings, and specifically addressing how we would review BESS projects if they do come before the commission. I'm joined by my colleague Gus Cordero, and we have a staff team of engineers and analysts who are kind of the subject matter experts in this area. I will start with this disclaimer and also point of clarification that I, as staff, am like an independent subject expert of the commission. The commission has 3 public service commissioners who are appointed by the governor. They serve on staggered terms. They're the ultimate decision makers of energy policies before the state. And I should also state, the MPSC, our mission is to serve the public through safe, affordable, and reliable energy and telecommunication services. So as part of the staff team, we provide recommendations to the commission on these projects, but again, we're not ultimately the decision makers at the end of the day. So much of this history was already touched upon, but I'll back up a little bit here to take us back to 2023. What was going on in the state leading up to the passage of the 2023 law was a lot of build out of renewable energies, but also lots of pushback from local communities for various reasons too. So the passage of the law sets up a voluntary, sometimes known as backstop citing authority to allow for a limited set of projects to come before the commission. And I think Ian already did a really excellent job laying out that it's limited projects, they're large-scale projects. We have authority for wind over 100 megawatts, and solar and battery storage over 50 megawatts respectively. And they may be presented by electric providers or independent power providers, meaning it could come from any developer, like from in-state or out-of-state, as well as the big investor-owned utilities of the state. And there's only limited conditions in which a project can come before the state. I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit, but again, just a little bit more history to set us up here. After the passage of the law in 2023, our commissioners granted this commission-owned motion, an order that directed staff, myself, and our colleagues to engage with all kinds of experts. Those included meeting with local units of government, with academia, our colleagues at the U of M and others, with project developers, and lots of other interested parties from the associations of townships and farmers and landowners. We hosted like about 9 public engagement sessions that culminated in the development of this application filing instructions and procedures, the AFIP, which you've heard mentioned already. So that initial order directed us to develop guidance for what are the best practices for implementing the new law. And on October 10th of that same year, the commission adopted this order, which then this AFIP became the commission's filing instructions. So it is essentially the guidebook for citing projects that come before the commission. And specifically, it defined some of the parameters around CREO. The previous presenters talked about it. I'll touch on it as well, and define what a local unit of government is. And essentially, it's the unit that's exercising zoning authority. And then later, a subsequent order came out to waive application fees. They've also already discussed the compatible renewable energy ordinance, but just, sometimes repetitive information is helpful, right? So CREO lays out this basic the minimum siting and zoning criteria for solar, for wind, and for storage. You see there's different setback distances required for different technology types. I'm not going to read through it all, but specifically section 226 sub 8 of the law describes the minimum criteria for a CREO. And to be considered a CREO, it must contain this minimum criteria and may not be stricter. This was explained extensively, but really it means that you can't have more extensive or more prohibitive setback distances or more prohibitive sound requirements. The applicable items for storage facilities, or BESS commonly called, would be 300-foot setback from the facility to occupied buildings or non-participating properties, 50 foot to the edge of the roadway, 50 feet to the fence line of the property. There's no limit for height. As for noise, it's same across all 3 technologies. It's 55 decibels. And as for lighting, must comply with dark sky friendly solutions. And the other notable item is specifically within the CREO definition in the law includes this NFPA standards. So any BESS project going through state siting must comply with these federally recognized best practices for safety for BESS. So the pathways were already quite adequately described, but I'm going to give you just a slightly different vantage just solely from the perspective of the MPSC, as it differs a little from the pathways explored already. I'm only going to talk about these 2 pathways that exist after the passage of 233. So 233 set up the construct of a CREO, which of course is a new concept altogether. And in the primary pathway 1 that retains local siting when a facility has a CREO. And in this instance, the developer must pursue the local siting, and that may or may not result in a project that's cited locally. But as has played out, as Madeline described, we're not actually seeing projects solely using the minimum criteria of a CREO. Nonetheless, the law set up a construct for that to take place. The latter is, the second pathway is state citing. And this is, of course, the new pathway of citing through the MPSC. So in instances, in limited circumstances, as we say, when local citing fails, there's a couple of pathways in which a project could come before the MPSC. And what that means in practice is it comes through a new administrative law process, which is adjudicated in the Michigan Public Service Commission, adjudicated by an administrative law judge, and it contains a pretty substantial 12-month contested case process. I'll describe that a little bit further. But I just want to emphasize workable ordinances 100% fully exist, but we don't have any jurisdiction over that, thereby I'm not really discussing it further. So how does it go to trigger the MPSC process? These pathways are spelled out in the law, but I'll just emphasize a few things that must happen if an applicant, developer, I'm using those terms interchangeably, if they choose to go through local citing, they must hold a public meeting in the affected local unit. They must inform the chief elected official, that's typically the township supervisor. They must send notice of its intent to hold the public meeting and notice to all of the residents within, for battery, for a 1 mile vicinity of the project. And they must publish the notice of the meeting in public newspapers. There's different triggering effects for if you're going through local citing. I don't think I'm going to walk through that in as much detail for sake of time. Pathway 1, so if an ALU, affected local unit of government, has a CREO, now what? Like stated, the developer is obligated to first go through the local unit. And again, like I said, that may or may not result in some passage of their project. But then secondly, there are specific conditions which a project may come to the commission despite having a CREO. So if a township does state affirmatively to the developer, yes, we have a CREO on the books for battery, yet if they fail to approve the project within a designated set of time, 120 days, if they fail to approve it, or second, if they deny the project despite it meeting those minimum standards of CREO, or third, if it amends the ordinance to become more restrictive than the CREO, that begins to open up pathways for a project to alternatively come to the state. And there are a couple of other pathways that I'll lightly touch on too. In a nutshell, this is what we would consider the CREO local citing pathway if a project were to successfully go through all of the steps as outlined in PA 233, reach out to the CEO, notify the clerk, meet with the township, notify of CREO status, hold the public meeting, and then submit their application. Theoretically, the ALU can approve that, and we never see it. So there's lots of instances which the MPSC has no jurisdiction or never really touches project. On the other hand, if ALU doesn't have a CREO, what are your options? So again, much like the previous presenter said, I'm not here to provide any kind of legal recommendations in any way, but just discussing the options and the pathways, of course. So there are a couple other ways which the project could come our way, and that's if the ALU has a moratorium in place. 2, if the ALU requests directly that the developer goes to the MPSC or commission. Or 3rd, if the ALU responds, we do not have a CREO. Those each open some pathways. And another one touched on is if you're more typical for solar, if it spans across 2 townships, if your neighbor township says, nope, we don't have a CREO, developer may take it to the state. These are exactly the situations that we're seeing play out with the 8 or so applications we have currently, is a mix of these. Mainly, developer has notified, nope, we do not have a CREO, or their neighbor has said, we do not have a CREO. We have not yet seen option 2. We have not seen a township specifically ask, take this to the commission. And we haven't seen the moratoria play out either. So that said, it's quite early in the implementation phase. So if the CREO pathway fails, the MPSC process comes available. And this is a little bit repetitive from what I had just said, but to reiterate, If ALU fails to approve, if the ALU denies the application, or if the ALU amends it, it opens this pathway. And thus becomes a contested case process before these three members who are appointed commissioners. Chair Dan Scripps is in the middle. On the left is Commissioner Catherine Paratic, and then Commissioner Shaquilla Myers on the right. So ultimately, they would review the record of evidence, and ultimately, the law requires that they must make a decision within 12 months of a complete application. Previous speakers already spoke quite a bit about utility scale solar, BESS in Michigan already. I just noted the same 115 or so that is currently operational. We too have had the chance to visit the Tibbetts site over in Coldwater and learned a lot from seeing that firsthand, and there's a few others in development in the way. So back to the AFIP. In a nutshell, this is a very prescriptive guidance doc that contains everything from site plan, local outreach efforts, environmental compliance, public benefits, decommissioning, and a very extensive link to a spreadsheet of more than 370 items that must be included in an application. I'm certainly not going to read over all of these types of exhibits, but I might use the time to talk a little more about the contested case process again, because I realize I don't have a slide on it and it might still be a little confusing. So when an application becomes submitted to the commission, what we as staff are tasked with doing is reviewing and scrutinizing, first to ensure that it's a complete application, that every item is indeed included, and then further, we're questioning it. We're asking for more supplemental background of how such data was reached, or confirming certain setback lines and distances. We're checking into all the accompanying regulations, the enviro regs, the local county drain commission. We're doing very thorough due diligence on ensuring that we have adequate information that the commissioners can satisfy the necessary determinations. So in other words, the law, Public Act 233, has series of determinations. A couple examples were previously mentioned, such as did the project reasonably consider alternative sites or alternative land uses? The full application must provide evidence to meet those. And what staff does, I'll actually fast forward to this. I remembered I had this. This is our contested case process from start to finish. And so where I'm talking about the application is the step one, even though acknowledging there's lots of activity that probably happened maybe for years before it has come to the commission. And then there's intervention. That's when the participating township and interested landowners can petition to be an official party to the case. If you're granted that party status, then you can file discovery questions. You can file formal recommendations by way of written testimony. Following testimony is rebuttal, a chance to respond to each other's testimony. There's deadlines set for each of these periods. So testimony, rebuttal, then a cross-examination hearing, again presided by over a judge. Attorneys can cross-examine each other's witnesses in the case. And then all of that evidence is bound and considered the record. That record contains recommendations for, against, and everything in between of our assessment of the project in each of those required determinations. Not just staff, but also the interested landowners and the township, should they be intervening. And in most of our cases so far, townships are intervening and they're submitting their own expert testimonies as well. Following the cross-exam, there's legal briefs, there's reply briefs, and then very close to the end of that 12-month period, the commission will issue its order. And after an order is issued, there's a period to appeal it or a motion to reopen the order. This contested case process mimics every other regulatory process we have at the commission regarding a rate increase from Consumers Energy or regarding a new gas pipeline that's to be constructed. It's the same milestones of that contested case process. So before I got too into the weeds, I thought I'd kind of backtrack. I don't have too much further. A lot was already stated. I'm now just going to highlight a few bits of legal framework that are specific to the BESS technology, because I know that's of most interest. we've talked about it already, but the legislation specifically has it must comply with the latest NFPA fire code. And I think it's really helpful, the way this law was written, that it's to the effective date of 233 or the most recent, the successor standard adopted by the commission. So I find that really helpful for like future-proofing. The safety standards are almost always going to be as up-to-date as possible. The additional requirements within our lengthy AFIP, there's a series of additional reports that are required for BESS projects. We talked about NFPA. Additionally, there's a series of reports called a commissioning plan, an emergency response plan, and a hazard mitigation plan, a hazard mitigation analysis, where the developer must very thoroughly explain its plans in each of these respective areas and how it complies with the fire codes. And furthermore, as was also touched upon, for battery projects, there must be an agreement for annual trainings to fire and safety departments. There's also, applicable to all types of projects, by the way, solar and wind and BESS, requires an emergency response plan and also a fire response plan. I know we're short on time, so I'll just kind of give it a moment to skim through that. I highlighted the one that I thought was of most relevance: commitment to review and update with these emergency and fire response entities at least once every 3 years. That's a minimum. So these conditions of the AFIP can actually be conditioned to be more frequent than that. Conditions have a lot more fluidity than the standards that are written within the CREO. And then similarly with fire response plans, this requires the at least once a year trainings and commitments to update the plans. As Madeline and Ian had echoed, these are what we consider very best practices, and certainly something that can be borrowed verbatim, if you will, for those communities working on workable ordinances and so on. And then wrapping it up, after and if if a certificate is granted by the commission in these projects, there's also a series of post-certificate completion reports that have to be filed. And so, well, we often refer to it as a 12-month contested case process. For projects that go through the commission, my staff and I, we essentially have some oversight and eyes on the project through the life of the facility. For solar, that's 30 years. And so there's subsequent reports and annual and every 5 years types of filings in which we're ensuring, annual maintenance plans, annual operations of all of the equipment is running properly, post-construction sound, ensuring year over year that sound is still falling within the minimum, the 55 dBAs, and that, of course, that the project was built according to the site plan. And not nearly going to spend a lot of time on this one, but decommissioning, of course, is critical here as well. We, if through the state process, do have a role in overseeing the decommissioning at the end of the life of the project. And before we get to that part, we're responsible too for ensuring the developer regularly submits plans, that they have the financial assurance and that they have an updated plan for how and what it would cost to decommission a facility at the end of the life. So we do have eyes on all of that. I know that's a lot of technical info, but I wanted to get through it a bit quickly because there's still pending questions from everyone. I'll just pause it at this contested case process too, as we kind of get organized around how you want to do questions. And if you may, I might propose that the three of us can kind of stand up here together, and we can address whatever questions you have.
Well, if you're comfortable with doing that.
Mike?
They're going to remove me if I don't push on this mic much more often.
Is it possible to have some questions from the commission and then open it to audience?
Yes, that's.
I have 3 or 4 questions I really am interested in.
Okay, that's what we were going to do. If we allow us to answer our questions. I know Mr. Plank had some, and so let's start off with Mr. Porter.
I'm curious, obviously you're aware that the MPSC order that implemented a lot of these additional conditions for approving these types of projects is being challenged in the Court of Appeals. What's going to happen if the Court of Appeals strikes down this order with all these regulations? Where are we going to be?
Sure. I can acknowledge that. So there is a pending Court of Appeals case, and just for context, shortly after the commission order passed in October 2024, a series of about 79 townships signed on to an appeal over the implementation, the commission's actions to implement the law, and ultimately its interpretation of CREO and ALU, among a few other things. Following that, again, the big disclaimer that I'm not an attorney, so I'm just kind of explaining my vantage point here. Following that, one of the preliminary decisions that had come out was that it didn't stay or didn't pause the commission staff's ability to do its implementation. So for the past year and a half, we, on the regulatory track, have been business as usual, meaning intaking applications and doing our work. And that continues to be the plan. I will say an update on the Court of Appeals is that it does have oral arguments scheduled for this month.
Yes.
And upon, it's really anyone's best guess of the timing of like when a subsequent decision could be reached following that. But I'm not here to speculate on any of those outcomes.
So we really don't have an answer of what's going to happen if the court should reject this order at this point. It's an unknown.
It's an unknown, and I don't think it'd be appropriate to opine on.
Okay. Within Act 233 itself, there's a number of times where it references the ability of the commission to impose more stringent requirements that the commission could adopt. I understand that's, I believe, what some of these are. What if a local unit actually did additional research, specifically scientific research with regard to the batteries themselves, and made recommendations to the Planning Commission to strengthen those areas of the MPSC's order? Would the MPSC consider amending this order and adding additional protections to protect the overall public?
Yeah, thank you for that question. If I'm interpreting it right, I think you're suggesting kind of making edits or suggestions to the order in U21547, so the commission's order that adopted the AFIP. I do recall that there's a line in there near the end that suggests that the AFIP will be periodically be revisited. So there's not like a set time for when that is to be opened and revisited, but if and when something like that happens, I imagine it could look similar to the stakeholder engagement work that we conducted in 2024, which was, hearing from a lot of local units and hearing from a lot of research that's out there. And so if foreseeably the commission wanted to open up and amend it, there would probably be an opportunity for that.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that, because that's one of the concerns that I have is I think there are additional things that could be looked at. Some of the people have asked a lot of good questions in our meetings, and one of them that maybe is oversimplification, but I think it makes sense. If we have 12,282 megawatts of BESS in the pipeline with MISO, why are we considering more across the state and putting all of these governmental units in the port communities through all of this? Isn't there some way to put some type of state hold on until if you only need, 25 or 3,500 megawatts, and you have 12,000 in the pipeline, why are we putting more in the pipeline, and why are we putting these communities and these people through this?
Do you want me to
Yeah,
just comment
sure,
really quick?
yeah.
I think it's just important to know that those MISO-Q numbers that were shown are extremely optimistic. So the MISO-Q always shaves off probably 90% of its quantity. The goal that utilities are trying to rise to, so the customer base that they're trying to facilitate through developers and projects, is 2,500 megawatts. So that's probably the general amount that we'll see it fall at if all of that deployment goes forward. So it's not actually going to be 15,000 megawatts.
So what I'm hearing, if even somebody out here wants a project, it might not go.
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
I'm speaking optimistically.
I see.
So if 90%
Oh,
of
I see
them
what you
go
mean.
away,
At that point, the developer may not have a direct line of who they're going to sell it to if the entire grid is supplied with all of its goals. But as you say, that's a distant hypothetical,
and
yeah.
one other last concern. I know there's a lot of talks about the tax benefit, but having represented the township in a lot of tax appeals over the years and having worked at the Michigan Tax Tribunal, I know that the industries are real good at presenting a great tax base initially, and then I could give you multiple examples where then they come back and they get the state to change the depreciation schedules, and all of a sudden communities that thought they were getting this big pie end up with something that's about the size of what McDonald's serves. Is that going to happen here?
I'm happy to start, and then I would, if you would like to add something. So, yes, so we have definitely seen this, at least for wind, for other land uses as well, where the developer, or with tax tables changed, and then developers argued, now we need to pay less taxes, and the township losing out on this. And so I think one of the reactions to this was for solar to actually create two options next to personal property tax, to actually enter a payment in lieu of taxes to really lock in a specific number. So that is a mechanism set forth in law that local government and developer can agree on. We currently don't have such a mechanism for either wind or BESS. So wind or BESS, personal property taxes is the way. In our guide on revenue streams, we actually talk about some strategies. There is a solar project in the UP, the Groveland Mine Solar Project, where the developer has offered a property tax guarantee for that solar project, with the idea generally being, this is the tax table right now, we're going to pay this amount of property taxes. If the tax table changes in favor of the developer, we still pay what we originally agreed to and promised to. If the tax table changes in favor of the local government receives those increased tax revenues. I don't know how workable that is. It is a very innovative strategy of developer and local community agreeing on a property tax guarantee. But this is definitely not standard practice across the board, and it is up to the developer to determine whether that is something that is reasonably workable for them in any specific case. Guidance from the State Tax Commission on how to tax battery storage has changed, and I wouldn't be surprised if it changes again. So having conversations with the developer or with an applicant about expectable tax revenue and really digging into these numbers and having a conversation of like, is it likely to change, might be helpful, because 100% agree with you. There have been disputes in the past based on tax table changes.
I appreciate that, and please don't take my question as an indication that the township is interested in tax revenues at all. Our board has consistently said that is not a factor for them whatsoever. Thank you.
I've got a somewhat simplistic question. I'm trying to understand, as a customer, how do my energy costs change from adding these systems?
I could
Sure.
generally talk about it. So if you're adding battery storage, so again, this comes to the question of the renewable portfolio standard kind of getting applied to the whole grid. So regardless of whether it's a neighboring township or your own hosting the battery, the general impact on a ratepayer is going to be consistent across consumers' territory, for example. So if there is a battery added in consumers' territory, I would say the general way to think about it is batteries kind of can only reduce energy costs necessarily. They only really act to remove expensive electricity, or when there's too much electricity, they fill up with cheap electricity, and then they distribute it later when there's not as much supply, and that reduces peak costs. That doesn't necessarily apply to solar and wind. So solar and wind that are actually generating the electricity, that changes the cost of the system in ways that are always kind of changing and always disputed, and I don't really think I could speak much about it. But for batteries specifically, that one has a pretty consistent relationship with ratepayer costs.
I guess the reason why I'm asking is you're telling me if I'm hearing right, I would, as a customer, be able to expect a decrease. Is this like automatically? Because I only tend to hear things going in front of the commission where you want a
Yeah,
increase.
right.
I don't see my prices coming down ever from it.
Totally. So that's the like theory of it, right? But then it all comes down to the utilities' actual like declaration of ratepayer prices. Utilities have to constantly make profit. Utilities have to constantly then upgrade their distribution lines and make new things. So I mean, it's any one piece of the grid doesn't really have that much say on the ultimate ratepayer cost. It really comes down to how the utility ends up packaging it all and seeing where they fit in. So I agree with you that there's kind of just a trajectory upwards. Do you guys want to comment on that? Okay.
I have a question. Will I be able to do my laundry at 2 PM and not pay higher rates if there's a battery facility?
So again, this is just in theory, you know, on paper, if there was as much battery as there was generation, then there wouldn't be a peak or an off-peak price. It would all be equally distributed at all times. But that's, again, on paper, as like a toy system, yeah.
I have a question. Okay, so the object of the batteries is to get power to the grid, so they can send it where it's needed. Could wind or solar not accomplish that same thing?
I think that one caveat I would put there is that the transmission lines and the distribution lines are moving the electricity, but batteries are meant to change when it is getting sent out. So if there's way too, like, you know, if there's so much sun shining and so much solar, that there's more electricity than can be used, battery is meant to offload that peak and then provide it later when there isn't as much electricity getting generated.
Yeah, and
Did you
I'll
wanna-
just chime in briefly. It's very common in Michigan that projects are being co-located or co-sited. So in DTE and consumers territories where they already have large amounts of land for an existing wind or solar project, it's quite common that we're seeing a development for a battery project on that same site. There's benefits of economies of scale, of course, and utilizing the same infrastructure for a substation, for instance. So we are going to likely see many more hybrid located projects. That's the term for like solar and battery on the same project site.
Mr. Chair, before we move off this agenda item, I'd like to introduce Taylor VanKal from Kalamazoo County Planning and Development Department, who I invited here this evening. So she could just say what her role is with the county.
Hello, I'm Taylor VanKal. I'm the Climate Sustainability Manager at Kalamazoo County. Part of how my work intersects with this is that we've been working with a lot of municipalities lately, municipal staff and elected officials on how to craft these ordinances. We've brought in Madeline Kroll's come and talked to municipalities and talked through those specific ordinances and got into that nitty-gritty. And we've done workshops, and then we're also going to be scheduling tours and things like that. So that's kind of how my work at the county level, I serve as a resource to connect local municipalities to those resources and facilitate those conversations. So that's what I'm doing.
Does the battery, if we have these batteries, does it have to be located next to a substation?
Yes, generally, all of the energy facility types we've discussed, solar, wind, and battery, they need to be grid tied or grid connected. And in order to do that, there's often a substation that's very close in proximity. It's called a project substation that's specific for that, like battery project to move or transport or store the energy into the grid system. Yep.
But, Ms. Kroll, in your presentation, you talked several times about grid access, okay? And from what I understood, you're talking about access to really the full eastern half of the United States. That's the grid, right?
Yes.
And for an access point, if you're generating the wind or the solar, or you've got the battery storage, all you need is 2 wires to hook up to a small substation to put it onto the grid, right?
It depends. So the big transmission power lines that you see kind of go across country are different than the local power lines, the distribution lines that your house is connected to. And so these are basically two systems, the local system and then the regional large system that connects you all the way to New York, eastern half. So the connection point between the local grid and the regional transmission grid are substations where the voltage is being stepped down and then it is distributed locally. And so when I talk about interconnection or access to the grid, a battery developer or a wind developer or solar developer can basically, where the big power lines are, imagine it as like an energy highway and you're building an off-ramp or on-ramp, sorry. So like you're cutting into the wire, set a substation there and connect your project to it to feed into that regional eastern half of the US grid. Now for solar projects, it isn't super common that developers cut the line and make this new connection point because it costs money, or it costs a lot more money than identifying an existing substation or exit of the power lines and connecting to that. But for battery storage, I have seen, and for solar as well, I have seen projects in Michigan where as long as there is a power line, a large regional power line, within a mile or two of that corridor is where developers want to build their substation and their project. Does that answer your question?
No, it just raised about 4 other different questions. When this township was zoned, okay, for some unknown reason, we put all of our industrial zoning on the east side of the township. I think that's because where most of the power came in on the east side of the township. It's where most of the people were, okay? And so we set up these areas. The western part of the township was no man's land. It was farmland as far as you could see. But as time has progressed, that has changed. And it just so happens we have a huge power line coming in to the western border of the township. And all our industrial zoning's on the eastern part. Isn't there any way that a developer could come in with one of these systems and say, okay, I'll put it over in the industrial area and we'll connect it to the grid and it'll feed back to this huge power station back here, which will feed it into the other lines? That's not possible?
This is where my engineering knowledge is crumbling, but my point is it's not just the access to the power grid, it's also, is there still space on the grid at that particular place on the east side of town? If the highway is full and jammed up, you can't connect a solar project in and put more power on the grid, right? And so, and how far that is data that is accessed by developers that I do not have access to, and how far certain parts of the power grid have capacity on them. But obviously, a new power line that can be scaled up in voltage and has additional capacity, it makes sense that a developer is looking at that and comparing where does a project might make more sense.
I can add too. So as part of the commission's instructions in the AFIP, if it goes that route, then the developer has to demonstrate its evaluation of alternatives, of alternative site location. And that's where the context of siting on farmland versus developed land kind of comes in. So specifically, developer has to explain why, like what led to their site location, specifically in this quadrant, what other sites were considered, and really demonstrate why, how they considered other feasible land sites, including those of brownfield and industrial sites. So that's specified in the law, that type of analysis must be included, and it's something we look at pretty closely.
But it sounds to me as though this is structured so if I can make the connection across the street by taking my extension cord over there and plugging it in, I want it over there because it's short, it's cheap, and I've got the big substation there. It might cost me more to transport that power from, over on the east side to that substation, but I can still do it. And isn't that something that they ought to be presenting before it gets to the MESP? Is there some way to have that brought up early rather than late?
Yeah, I think this kind of comes down to the developer's engagement with the community. So again, that's a part that we're not really privy to. This is all the pre-MPSC steps. But foreseeably, yeah, the developer could be in conversations locally with the township to talk about your preferences, to talk about, specific alternative site locations that you all might know about. If, on the other hand, if it does make it to the contested case process, again, like I mentioned, township still has an opportunity to be at the table and present your recommendations, your alternative options, should it be at the state process. So just wanted to really point that out, that you still have involvement and can have opportunity to have alternate recommendations, should it go through the state.
Does anybody have anything else? All right, then. I'm going to open this up for thank you very much for your time and your effort and for your education.
Thanks.
All right, to members of the public, we're going to open this up for public comment, where you can come and state your question on the record. We might be able to get an answer to it if it's short.
And I would just add, you don't have to be on an agenda item. You have 4 minutes to talk about whatever you want.
Thank you. And you're going to give me my 1-minute warning? Okay, thanks. I'm Bruce Goethe, Oshtemo Township resident. I live my closest property line is about a half-mile downwind of the proposed site. Although no one's applied for a site yet, I do know that. Thanks for coming. Don't know why you guys are here. Why are we here? All 7 of our elected township officials are on record as against the project. Trustee Zach Ford said he would lay his body down in opposition to lithium ion, which is the dominant 98% figure that you mentioned. He doesn't want lithium ion in Oshtemo. We don't either. That's why we're here. So there's a question, why are you here? We've learned a little bit, but yeah, you're not going to plug 2 wires into a 48,000 volt overhead power line, but step down options are available. That power line that came in was opposed by the township. We sued them, and they came in anyway because they could seize it if they wanted by eminent domain. Someone filed a Freedom of Information request. That's how we know that Oshtemo officials met with the energy company. One of their, Oshtemo's great questions was about the lifetime of the batteries, and they said, well, it was 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. So Ian's remarks about once it's built, it just keeps running, that is not true. Their company is saying, our lifespan is limited, we'll keep replacing batteries through the life of the project. You guys didn't talk about necessary infrastructure. I don't know what it is. Obviously, you got to tie into the grid. Do we have to have a water service so all of our firefighters can stand there and watch it burn? Does there have to be a cell tower nearby? Sarah showed a photo of a site visit to a BESS facility. Why did they all have to wear hard hats? It's so safe. It's a 50-foot setback from the road. So, of course, all bicyclists should wear a helmet, but what about someone walking their dog by there? What about children walking and enjoying our countryside residential part of our township? Obviously, not really that many questions, but your slides talk about sound. Sounds are things like speech, music, birds singing. You're talking about noise. There's tons of research about noise and the stress it causes. Lots of that research has been done at the University of Michigan. So easy to make use of and access. So we're all against it. Our township officials are against it, everybody here is against it, and oh joy, we get to have an out-of-state landowner leases land to an out-of-state energy company. And-
You're at 1 minute.
Thank you. And we're, really nothing we can do about it. That's what we've been told. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Rob Morrison. I'm an Oshtemo resident. I live in the industrial area, which is chock full of schools, residences, and churches. So that's an interesting zoning issue. I'd like to thank all of our speakers who, I know some of them came a long way today here in person. And this was a ton of information, and I loved it. It was really helpful for me, and so I had a great education tonight. And this is my second time I've seen a presentation on PA 233. So thank you for coming tonight. This is a real public service. I have a question about the process. In section 226, subsection 6, developers have to provide documentation about that the project doesn't unreasonably diminish farmland and doesn't present an unreasonable threat to public health or safety. And I'm really trying to keep a straight face saying that. But that's a problem I have with PA 233. But in this process, the developer is going to be providing this documentation. For what I saw, they have a checklist of things. So it's their responsibility, but they have their own interests. What if a community has a different perspective, different interests that they want to put into that process? Do they do that during a contested process? Or I just want a clarification on what a community could do if they have different information than the developer. So thank you.
Thank you. So I'll just outline, there are a couple of ways to be involved directly in the contested case process should a project come before the commission. So any adjacent landowner may participate. If you're directly next to the project, you get to participate by right. So meaning you have to do some paperwork, but you're almost automatically granted a status in the case. Other neighboring residents, anyone in the community, even neighboring communities, can also file a petition to intervene. So after the application is filed to the state, if it is, all of the residents within a 1 mile radius would receive a notice, as well as there'd be a newspaper publication with some information around the pre-hearing conference. And at the pre-hearing conference, it's an event that's held virtually over Microsoft Teams. That's the point you would file your petition to intervene. And so as an interested resident, you would basically fill out a form and some information of why you maybe caused harm by the project. And then it's up to the judge, the presiding administrative law judge, to grant status to landowners as participants in the case. So that's the formal route in which you get to formally put your positions into the contested case record. The second route is called public comment. Quite similar to this type of forum, but public comment means it's allowable for anyone at any point in time to public written comments by way of an email or a comment into this comment box system we have on the electronic docket system. So that takes place through the entire 1 year process. And so we receive, for example, many public comments just of residents with any kind of interest or issues on the case. I will say the difference with public comment, those are not formally part of the commission record, which the commissioners can base their decision on. So that's the distinction. Only if you're an intervener to the case, then your formal recommendation is part of that record. So those are the couple ways to be involved. We've got some useful links on our webpage under a frequently asked questions page that I can point out to anyone later.
Good evening. My name is Katie Schneider. I'm a business owner, a farmer, and a parent here in Oshtemo Township. The South VanKal BESS is proposed on my south property line. right next to my pumpkin and organically grown produce farm. I want to point out a basic point of concern, that a law had to be enacted to force these utility-scale projects in places you don't see them. And the second part that EGLE pointed out, that incentives into the millions are needed to accelerate these projects. If you need laws to force projects and millions to encourage communities to abide, it makes sense to be questioning things and pushing back. I can tell you there are over 350 families with signs in their yard against this project. There are 1,500 of us that belong to the No Oshtemo BESS Facebook group, and we currently have over 1,000 signatures on our petition against this project. I understand that battery chemistries are being studied now. We know that from recent developer communications that the South VanKal project is already planned, designed, and has been solicited to Consumers Energy in the last 2 weeks. This project is pending a bid choice to be chosen or declined next week. That would be the 16th. I recommend anyone that has an environmental concern where this project is leased on South VanKal Street, contact Consumers Energy today, as they are actively reviewing this project over the next couple of days. This very important project has been active in Township Hall since at least last June. Waiting until now, after the developer has solidified their plans and solicited it to the utility, may prove to be too little, too late. We may soon be at the MPSC. Some questions I have. We're seeing other projects around the U.S. will build their own substation if available. So I believe that negates something that we had just heard, that they need that substation right there. Will the MPSC consider local zoning? If the township has allowed the project in rural residential, what reason is there for the MPSC to deny the project application in our backyards instead of steering them to a more appropriate site? The MPSC mentioned that if they cite the project, they'll go back and make sure the project followed the plan. What if the developer didn't? How does that go? Because we are seeing that around the U.S., that certain things are sold during the applications and during projects that don't come to fruition. Another question, where does the money for the EGLE grant come from? I believe I had read somewhere it comes from the EPA. Where do they get their money from? Do they have some way of making their own income to pay for these grants? Or does it come from taxpayers? EGLE also mentioned that the annual fire training was required. And I can tell you that really speaks volumes to the risk of a project like this. In 2025, 2 BESS projects that I've looked at were in Colorado and New York. Did those projects follow the fire standards that we're requiring? And if so, what happened? And why are we still repeating this? I believe that fire in New York, that was the 3rd time. And after the 2nd time, they had promised upgrades. And yet, fire number 3, and now that stands sitting there unable to be turned back on again, an eyesore. And I can tell you where this project is going is not remote. It is in backyards. Technically, 8 of them align that property in rural residential, or as Mr. Morrison pointed out, what we now would consider to be an industrial zone based on what's going on there.
I'm sorry, your time is up.
Oh, I missed my minute warning. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tom Whipple. I'm an Oshtemo resident. And I had some questions, already showing like the different options as far as financing and all the legal things that have to be done or options that they could take and do it. My big question is like their history of these power plants. Every time I look, there's another one blowing up. And it's just like, aren't they a little ahead of themselves? Have they not done enough R&D before they actually release these things? And who is responsible when these things blow up, when they take and they damage the environment? Who gets stuck with that? I mean, is that a hit and run deal or something, or are they actually liable for that? When that damages the water, the land and such, or if you've got a farm? That's the big concern for me. Another thing is like, we're talking about Colorado. That one had taken and blown up. 9 workers that were there were injured, and they took them all to ER, and then for some reason hazmat got involved, and they took and they quarantined the ER for a day, trying to do is, get a handle on this. Well, that being the case, how long does this stuff linger on in the water and in the area? I'm thinking if somebody's got a farm or something, and if it's contaminated that much of the dirt and the water, the air and stuff, what does that do to a person's value of their properties too? It seems like if I haven't seen much success with these things, on paper, maybe it looks like it's a great idea, but I'm surely not seeing that from what research I've done and pulled up. And I would think that they need to do is take and resort to some other means, either go back to the drawing board and come up with something that's safer. A lot of those too, like what the young lady was saying before me, that they had the one in New York blow up, and what was it? There was one of them that blew up in that area, that it blew up once, and they came up with all the excuses. Yeah, we got control. We got, it just got away from us. Second times it takes and blow up, and they take and they look at it, in a different means, saying like, what happened here? Why aren't the fire department trained actually to keep this under control? And it just doesn't seem like a good decision at all to make, to put something in this area. If you can't be safe with that, and with the running record that these things have gotten, I don't see the significance, of even allowing them to come into our state. And then contaminating water, of course, we've been known as the Great Lakes state. What does that do to tourism for people that fish and such like that too? It sure sounds like it, I haven't seen results on how that they can take and clean this up, and they have no idea how long it takes. And that's a big concern for me, like if it's contaminating stuff, is that as bad as a nuclear reactor running away and, having an episode? I certainly can't agree with it, but I'll let you make your own decisions with something like that, but I surely don't think we need them in Michigan. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Terry, and I live on VanKal, not far from Katy. Thank you for coming and sharing your expertise with us tonight. We do not oppose clean energy, but even consumers' energy own future clean planning includes a mix of resources, including nuclear and natural gas, to meet reliability and emission goals. Those facilities are not placed next to neighborhoods. They are placed in industrial zones where they belong. The last 2 public versions of Oshtemo's energy ordinance allows utility-scale industrial projects as a special use in rural residential while simultaneously being expanding industrial areas in the master plan, even restricting solar from those industrial zones. That effectively funnels projects like this one into residential areas by design. Didn't the board just turn down Kroger because they wanted the project in an inappropriate area and turned out a family in rural residential because they're teaching kids to play golf would be too noisy? Even EGLE advises community to review their master plans and use zoning tools to guide appropriate citing. The Graham Institutional specifically cautions against simply reacting to develop proposals, and this isn't about the battery storage, it's about where the specific area is. The South VanKal site is a sensitive receptor site that borders multiple neighborhoods and homes with families that would struggle to evacuate if an incident occurred upwind of them. That's me. The site lies over a shallow, highly permeable aquifer, county-wide water source. It includes wetlands, groundwater recharge areas of up to 24 inches of water a year. And it sits in the headwaters at Hayden Creek, which feeds directly into the Pawpaw River. And this is not just farmland. This is connected environmental system, water, agricultural, and wildlife. And the two specialty farms that share property lines with this project have MAEP, EAP certification. Those certifications are not casual. It means those farms are recognized by the state of Michigan for implementing verified environmental stewardship practices to protect soil and water quality. Specialty farms also require a healthy ecosystem, even with the MPSC considers in their application. So now we are considered placing into an industrial scale battery facility directly adjacent to that. This project is not early stage, it's not hypothetical, and it's already far along. The South VanKal battery site has been under lease since December of 2023. The developer worked off the ordinance shared with them last summer that would only be minor changes per email. They have completed surveys, completed project plans, and chosen their battery chemistry already. Have a finalized project budget and are now in the final stages of securing a contract with Consumers Energy. That contract could be finalized within days. Yes, it will take a couple of months for the votes of the ordinance that are being done here, and they're ready to turn their applications in on the project right about when the moratorium ends or the developer heads up to the MPSC, I can't say that, with everything set up here. After all, the cellular tower to connect to BESS was just approved on M Avenue. Municipal water for the site may be in the works too. Please contact Consumers Energy today and share your concerns with the project's environmental. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. Some of the information that you provided has given me a few questions, although I did write a speech, so we'll see if I have time to get to that. My main questions are two-part. It relates to the Workable ordinance and the timing of it. So on the one page, we discussed pay attention to deal breaker items, and it's especially problematic when a developer has already identified a project location. So my thought is, we don't actually have an applicant yet here in Oshtemo. So have they actually identified a location? And would this be an opportune moment in our Workable ordinance to say, we are going to put these things in the proper location in an industrial zone because they have not identified a location? So that's the first question. The second part is the flip side of that. So if a Workable ordinance is to be determined whether it's workable or unworkable, that's a conversation with the developer. So is it smart then to be creating a Workable ordinance now when we don't have an applicant and we can't have this conversation with them? Because if we create an ordinance, then what do we know about whether they think it's workable or not? So that's just my question. Now, later, things to think about. So here's my speech part. You've said yourself that Oshtemo Township changes right about 8th Street heading west. Less densely populated, I believe, was the phrase. In my opinion, that whole end of the township might as well belong in Van Buren County because our lifestyle doesn't fit into the so-called growth taking place in Oshtemo. We have the right to the preservation of life and liberty, the pursuit of happiness, just like everyone else. And you know how we do that? We have family farms. We have roadside stands with fresh organic produce. We have apple orchards, strawberry fields, and pumpkin patches. Ms. DeForia, I'm sure you remember bringing your kids to a pumpkin patch in the fall when they were young, or possibly going to get cider and donuts at a local farm. Do any of you have grandkids? Do any of you know what joy looks like on a little boy who's been hoisted up onto a farmhaul tractor? Because I do. We have residents who want to raise horses and cows. We have landowners who straight up refuse to sell property because it's family farmland. Even when the neighborhood next door paves a road right up to the edge of their property line with obvious intentions to expand, Oshtemo farmers hold steady. Just because we can does not mean that we should. Western Oshtemo is a rural residential agricultural land that is loved for that very reason. It is why we choose to be here. It has heritage, memories, and a meaning that many people from cities will never understand, even if they do like to swing out there in June and pick their own sweet Michigan strawberries for a day. This project you are discussing is an industrial project. Any energy project is just that. It belongs in an industrial location. The ironic convenience of the substation, the power lines, a brand-new cell tower, gas lines, and what water lines next? It means nothing, because once you place something like this project here, you will mar the face of Oshtemo forever. Thank you.
Thank you for all of your information tonight. It's a bit overwhelming. We're looking at it from the ground where we live. My name is Danita. My husband and I have property adjoining to where this BESS facility is planned. And as a developer, when you do the bird's eye view and look at the map, this looks like the perfect spot. There's a big substation, there's empty ground right there. It's perfect. But what you don't see in the area around that is the Mott's Bird Sanctuary that's less than a mile away from there, an 80-acre bird sanctuary that's been in existence since 1971. I don't imagine the noise and the lights from a BESS facility that's on 24 hours would do much for the birds in that facility over there. There are the two specialty farms that have been spoken about tonight. They have it's special because it's natural. It's good for the environment. They are there to provide things for our families that you can't get in a grocery store. It's something that can't be interrupted by, again, the lighting and the sound. There's a shallow aquifer there. Should there be a fire, and they do put water in that area, it's going to ruin our wells. That's what we have out there. We don't have public water yet, unless someone's planning to put that in soon. We don't know. So again, that's a danger to all of us that live there. Our property has 20 acres of woods that's adjoining right to where this would be. It's far back from the road. How would a fire there be contained when it's a hot summer, dry summer, and there's a fire that gets extremely hot? How would they ever contain that? And I don't think our volunteer firemen should be put in that position to have to be in the toxic fumes of that battery. There are also 7 housing developments tucked in that area all around there. You don't see that from the road when you look at this little 52 acres where that will go. The one development directly across the street has 130 homes in it. They live in Oshtemo Township. They don't have a voice in this, but they look at this every day. We have to fight for them as well. This is a rural residential area. Something this size, probably bigger than Coldwater's, doesn't belong there. We have to fight for that. And if the MPSC has stricter standards, we have to fight for everything they look at and make this go as long as we can. And maybe like what Mr. Porter says, they won't need it by the time they get to ours. Let's push this out as long as we can and not make it comfortable for them. Make the developer have to go the full length and look at every possible place that could go other than among our homes. We trust you with our homes, our future, and our lives. One of my questions that I submitted that didn't get addressed was, how will we know that place is on fire? How will we know it's time to leave? I don't hear a tornado siren out there. There's nothing out there to let us know. There's danger, get out. And where would we go? We have horses, we have animals to care for. We don't have time in a structure fire like that, as dangerous as they are. That's a fear I live with every night when I go to sleep, and I wake up with every morning. I'm scared. And I know a gentleman last week at the Planning Commission said, we have one in Kalamazoo already. What are you worried about? Well, that's 1 megawatt. Look what they're trying to put into this area. Please consider everything possible to stop it from going in our residential area. It does not belong there. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Seeing no one else, I'm closing the public comment portion of the meeting. Planning commissioners, do you have anything that you want to state or put on the record? I want to thank everyone who came tonight and placed their questions on the record. I know this is a very hotly contested issue. I know your emotions run very deep on it, and we may not show it, but emotions run very deep on this panel too as to what's going on. And we're trying our best to follow the law. We're trying our best to follow a pathway that gives us the best chance of making sure Oshtemo remains what we want it to remain. I know that is not fast enough for many of you. I know that many of you think that we're not being open. A lot of the things you talked about, we find out from you and later from the staff. I mean, we don't have up-to-the-date information, but we're getting new information every day, and we will continue to do the best possible job that we can. Thank you. Are there any other updates or business that have to be brought? Being nothing further then, looks as though we've completed the agenda. It is now 8:26, and I declare the meeting adjourned. Okay.